Great. And we're live. So, welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette, and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today, on the line, all the way from Singapore, I have Heather HANSEN. Heather, you are a global communication specialist, the founder and director of Global Speech Academy, and you're currently working on a PhD in linguistics, and you're the author of several books. The most recent one, which we're going to dive into today, is called Unmuted: How to Show Up, Speak Up, and Inspire Action. We're going to get into all of that, but I first want to dive into the opening question, which is, what does your virtual office look like, and what do you need to get your work done?
Oh, I love the question, and I came prepared. So those of you who are watching our interview right now, you get the inside look at my office. I'll walk you through it for those who are listening. So you can see when we went into the pandemic, I really just used what I had. A lot of people went out, especially in my line of work, trainers, speakers, got all this high-tech fancy stuff. I used my laptop and an old laptop, and I put them next to each other. And then I grab my iPad and I do some notes on that when I'm talking to clients. I have my good trusty Audio Technica AT2020 USB mic that I've had since around 2012, I think. And then the only new thing I bought was that Canon camera. And I have some nice photo lights that I use. And the addition since then is a pull-up green screen that I use behind me if I need to and I want to have my slides, because usually if I'm training, I'll be standing with my slides as my background, and the green screen really does make a difference in making it just that much crisper. So I try to keep things really, really simple. I've actually removed some of that tech throughout the time of the pandemic. I like to have as few possible tech errors as possible, really.
Indeed, indeed. And the more moving parts, the more that things
More can go
go
wrong.
wrong, right? Right. If you've been doing it for a while, you have been
Yeah,
patching tech together for ages and ages. It's true. And thank goodness it's getting easier and easier as we go
it
along. And if I think
is.
about
Yeah.
presentations I did years ago online, it is so much easier
Mm-hmm.
today. So much easier.
Mm-hmm.
So, where do you primarily do most of your work? Is it from your home office?
Yeah, right here. I'm sitting in my home office now, and really, even if we're now, I think we can officially say we're post-pandemic. Even now, the majority of my work has remained online. So, what happened when we moved online as a speaker and trainer, my audience became global overnight. It was already pretty global, but that meant a lot of travel before. People weren't willing to trust the online technology and online training, even though I've been begging clients since 2012 to 14 to, can we please start moving this online? No, 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 it will never be as effective. It's not as engaging. And my argument has always been that depends 100% on the trainer and the person managing all the tech. So even today, I'd say probably 80% of my work is still online, if not more. I do a lot of work with the United States now, which is very difficult with time zones. Clients in Europe, all over Asia, but I've had clients all over Asia for a long time. So yeah, I primarily work from here. And then for a full day training, if they want it in person, then I'll travel to the client.
hmm hmm So
Mhm.
before we get into the book and other topics around that, since you are working with such diverse time zones, any tips that you use to make it work? Because what is the difference between Singapore and the US? It's quite a bit.
It's it's really awful. To the East Coast, it's 12 hours. So it's like working the night shift. And during the winter, it's 13 hours. And then, add three more to get to the West Coast. So, I have some half day training programs that can run from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. my time, because we're trying to get California and New York all on the call together. So that's been the one big challenge for me. And the older I get, the more I want that sleep. And so that has been the biggest challenge, and it affects my day after. I have to plan properly to make sure my morning, so I can hopefully sleep in a bit, although I rarely do. And it's really intense calendar management, and luckily I do have a full-time staff who manages my calendar, who's really good about giving me the space that I need. Whether or not I use it is another question, but that's been the biggest challenge, I'd say.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's fine to do trainings in the middle of the night when we're in our early 20s, but it
Yeah,
gets more
but add 20
challenging.
to that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've
Gets a little bit harder.
it's confronting. It's very confronting. It's your
Yeah,
brain can do it,
yeah.
but your body simply
Uh-huh.
doesn't. So
Yeah.
good planning and calendar management and good
Hmm.
self-care are really good
Yeah.
tips for time zone management. So I love that. I love
Mm.
that. Now, in a remote environment, a lot of us can relate to the feeling of being muted, right? So we're either on
Absolutely.
mute by accident or people are loud and taking over the meeting, so we're not getting heard. We don't get a chance to say the quieter voices, just don't get a chance
Mm-hmm.
for their voices to be heard. You've got a book out now that directly addresses this. It's called Unmuted, like we said before, How to Show Up, Speak Up, and Inspire Action. Why did you write this book?
Well, you just mentioned one of the reasons we were going into lockdown, into the pandemic, and Zoom became a thing. And we all started going on these virtual meetings. And the first thing you would hear every single time someone tried to speak was, "You're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute." And yep, there you go, you're
I
on
have a
mute. Oh, I
special
love that
card for it. I was holding
card.
up the
I
super card.
love it. That's so great. I need that. I'm going to order some of those.
I will send one to you, of course.
Oh, I'd love it. I'd love it. So we were hearing that all the time. And I kind of had this epiphany that, even before these remote meetings and online work, there were a lot of people who were on mute, right? Who were sitting in boardrooms, who weren't speaking up, who were muting themselves. And so I thought that that was a really good metaphor for how a lot of businesses have been running long before the pandemic. And moving into the pandemic, I think everyone just had this reawakening of what was important to us and how we wanted our world to look and what kind of work we wanted to be doing and how we wanted to balance that with our families. And I thought now more than ever, we need all the voices at the table. We need everyone speaking up. We need to be listening to everyone and giving room to everyone. And so that's what Unmuted is really about. How do we, both from a leadership perspective and also from the individual's perspective, how do we create environments where every voice is heard and every voice feels that they belong and can contribute?
It is one of the big contributors to, well, one, a feeling of belonging, but that feeling of trust and
Mm,
wanting to engage with an organization, which is being able
yeah.
to be heard. One of the aspects of that is the encouragement of creating an environment of active listening. And you have this
Mhm.
also in the book as well. And I've heard this a number of times. There's a wonderful book called Time to Think by Nancy Klein, all
Mm,
about active listening that I can
mhm.
recommend. But for those that have never heard of it, what does active listening mean?
Yeah, and I talk about active listening also from a very linguistic perspective because I deal with a lot of international people. My life is very international. And in remote work, especially, we have a higher percentage of people who are dealing across cultures and across languages. So when we're doing that, we have to be really aware of some of our biases around, especially as someone coming from the US, for example, someone who was born into English and has that privilege of full confidence and power in the language. We really need to slow things down and listen, not just to the voice and not paying attention to accent and the way the words come out, but listening to the meaning behind that message, really listening to the person. And that's really what I stress when it comes to active listening is that it starts there of uncovering what causes us to maybe not listen or to shut down because we're tired and frustrated. And then we hear an accent, and, oh, they're so hard for me to understand. And oh, I don't have the energy for this today. And why are you closing down? Why are you shutting down your thinking and your effort? So remembering that communication goes both ways, and especially in this remote and virtual environment, we have to work even harder to make sure that every voice is heard at the table because it's so easy now online to press mute and turn the camera off and just fall into the background and go unnoticed. So it's about being more aware in general.
So you've mentioned one of the things that happens when active listening is not occurring, which is we're shutting down.
Mhm.
What does good active listening look like or sound like? I'm not sure how to ask that.
So, what I encourage people to be doing, especially in our virtual world, is to really be paying attention to who has spoken and who has not, making sure that everyone has contributed to a meeting. If people are not contributing to the meeting, then maybe asking, why are they there? Is there a reason for them to be there? Are you holding, and this was a big problem when we moved into the pandemic. People went into meeting overdrive. I mean, we were morning to night on online calls and meetings that were absolutely unnecessary, stuff that even before we would have just handled with an email or a Slack chat. And now we were having meetings for literally everything. And I think that's calmed down a bit, but making sure everyone there, there's a purpose for them being there, first of all, and then making sure that everyone has contributed, whether that means that you have sent out agendas in advance, given people certain roles, told them in advance you'd like them to report on specific subjects, and then monitoring the conversation itself, inviting people into that conversation to ensure that everyone is heard. So you might, the best way I think of doing this is to acknowledge them and then invite. So you build the confidence, because a lot of times it's a lack of confidence that's causing people to turn down their volume and not speak up and jump in. They either don't know how to jump in or when to jump in, especially with cross-cultural differences. And then even if they are about to do it, maybe it's just the confidence holding them back. So to say something like, oh, Diane, I know that you have been so deep in the numbers of this project. You know every single figure and you've put together so many great Excel sheets. Could you please tell us and help us to understand what's going on here? So first you acknowledge their unique brilliance, and then you bring them into the conversation. And then they come into it like, oh, wow, thank you. You know, wow, you're really acknowledging my contribution. Yes, I'm happy to tell you what I know. And I found with the teams I work with, that's been a helpful bridge for bringing them in. So when we're practicing active listening and being more inclusive, we're able to get more innovation. We're able to have a sense of belonging, more engaged employees, nobody falling asleep in the meeting, you know, people who are actually there to do their work and contribute. And that's really what we want and need.
I really love that. So acknowledge their unique brilliance of why are they uniquely at this meeting, which is great.
Mhm.
And then invite them to contribute based on the reason that they're in the meeting to begin with. I love that. One of the companies that I worked at used to have a policy of no meetings. If you wanted to have one, you had to convince other people to join, which ensured that everybody had a specific purpose for being there. And I thought it was a
Yeah,
great technique for
I
sort of
love that.
shifting the responsibility of calling it, because indeed, in this age of remote, you can just push a button, call a meeting, and waste
It's so
everybody's time.
easy.
It's too
Yeah.
easy.
And
Yeah, it's way too
something
easy.
something that could have taken 3 to 5 minutes can end up being a half an hour meeting. And it's just not necessary. We can actually do things a lot faster. So there are a lot of meetings that waste a lot of time. And my feeling is that we started wasting more time now that we've moved them online.
Indeed, indeed. All right. So I want to move on to virtual communication and
Mm,
talk a little bit about linguistics and diversity and inclusion,
mhm,
because you're approaching diversity and inclusion from a different way that I've seen before, and you're approaching it through language. What can we learn about diversity through language and how we speak to each
mm,
other?
yeah.
It's a
This is
broad
this is
question.
a
I'm sorry, it's like really
It's
big,
a
but you
big
could,
one.
yeah, tackle it
And
from
you
any
know
angle.
what? When the next book comes out, we'll come back and have another discussion because it's 100% on this topic. But it's all around the biases that we have to listening and understanding different accents, different ways of speaking, different styles of speech. So, under the umbrella topic of accent bias, we know that it can affect hiring decisions, it can affect promotion decisions. So, you know, you get into a meeting and somebody speaks in a way that's different from you. And just like all the other areas of diversity, because they are different, it breaks down the trust that you immediately have for the person. Maybe you feel they haven't made as strong of an impression, or you don't find them as eloquent, because we have all of these stereotypes in our mind of what eloquence sounds like, usually a 55 plus white male from America. So we have these biases. We grow up with them. They're in our media, they're in our Disney films, our cartoons, and it's everywhere around us without us really knowing. And it's not something that's talked about a lot in the diversity and inclusion discussion, yet it's at the foundation of everything. Because when you pick up the phone, or anyone who's listening and not watching us right now, they've already created a picture in their mind of what I look like. Hopefully they know what you look like, but they don't know what I look like, yet they've probably guessed my race. They've guessed, even if you hadn't said where I'm from, and I can't remember if you did, but they've already guessed where I'm from in the world. They probably have guessed about, what my education level is, and if they think they can trust what I say. So they do that all by hearing the way I speak. And I was born into, as you were as well, we were both born into a very privileged accent. We can go anywhere in the world, people typically will understand us. They consider the way that we speak quite eloquent, trustworthy, educated. If we came from the southern states, it would be very different. If we came from the Bronx, it would be different. If we came from New Jersey, Boston, Minnesota, and you and I know what all of that means, right? But people outside of the US may not realize what those differences are. But it's true of every single language in the world, and within every community, society, we have these biases. And then they show up in the workplace as when we're grown-ups, and we suddenly have a remote worker on the other side of the world, maybe in the Philippines, maybe in India, maybe we have some kind of support, maybe anywhere in Europe. I mean, it could be anywhere. And then these differences suddenly come up, and we aren't really ready for those reactions that we have.
I'm sitting here just like nodding. I can really relate. I've lived in the Netherlands now for more than 10 years. And of course, I've been trying to learn the language here as well. And when
Mhm.
I'm in conversation in Dutch with other people, I can't express myself in the same
Mhm.
way. I don't even try to make jokes because it comes across so odd. Like it
Mhm.
just doesn't work because I don't know the
Yeah.
language well enough to be nuanced. And
Mhm.
I come across as less educated because I can't express myself
Mhm.
properly. And it really is a
Yep.
good reminder to think about the people that we're working with, and that
Mhm.
is not the case. It's just that we can't express ourselves properly in the language being
Yeah.
spoken. And it must go, I mean, that's just for speaking, but writing
Mhm.
and right. I mean, if I were to
Yeah,
write
it
an
comes
email
through
now in
everywhere.
Dutch, it comes through everywhere. So, and it must
Mhm.
be exhausting for those of us that don't have English or,
Absolutely.
yeah. So,
Absolutely. Like, think how long it takes you to write an email in Dutch, and how many times you second guess and you correct and everything else, right? I mean, I'm the same in Danish. I lived in Denmark 8 years. My husband's Danish. We speak Danish at home. I'm fluent in Danish. And yet I always say to everyone I know in Denmark, if you don't know me in English, you don't know me, because they think I'm like a fifth grader, even though I speak the language incredibly well. But because of this heavy accent that I have, that's obviously English speaking, luckily in their minds, that is one of the charming accents. I've noticed that as your skin tone gets darker and darker, the accent gets less charming in Europe specifically. And
wow.
so, again, I'm very lucky that I was the kind of foreigner that they liked and wanted to have. And I've had people say that to me outright. So you can see as
Wow.
well how closely accent is related to race and ethnicity, your status in a society, whether you're seen as educated, whether you're seen as trustworthy. All of this comes into play. I was never treated with the same respect when, or even today, I'm never treated with the same respect when I speak in Danish as I am in English. They'll stop meetings to tell me how charming my accent is. And I sit there thinking, if we were speaking English right now, you would never say something like that to me right
Right.
now. You would be so engaged with what I was saying that you wouldn't even think about how I was saying it. And yet that's all you see and hear when I'm speaking Danish. So, we are lucky, you and I, because just about anywhere we can say, well, okay, why don't we just speak English then? We get our power back. Suddenly we're at the top of the food chain again, and we have the eloquence, we have the power, we dominate the discussion. But what about all the people who can't do that? Mandarin speakers and Tamil and Indonesian and Tagalog, and I mean, just you name it, they can't do that. And how do they then compete in a global world, a remote world, in English, and reach the same levels of success that we have handed to us in many cases? And we don't realize as well that we have that privilege.
So, as leaders in a workforce, let's focus on leadership because I think, I
Mm,
mean, this comes down to everybody, right? It is too
yeah.
important to leave to the managers. However, it is really, I think that culture in an organization is driven by how the leaders behave.
Mhm.
And so, what can leaders do to minimize this kind of bias in the workforce, or to at least
Mhm.
recognize where it exists and try to do something about it? What are some of the
Yeah.
tangible steps that we can take to minimize
Yeah.
this? Because as you speak it, I
Mhm.
think I have this reaction of like, no, no, it can't be, it can't be like that. Sounds, it's so unfair. And okay,
Yeah.
then get over
It
my
is. It's
emotional
so
reaction. It is
unfair.
unfair. And what can we do for those of us
What
who
can we do?
really genuinely want to do something about it?
Mhm. So, from a leadership perspective, the first step is just to start talking about this. Second step, get it in the DEI policy. I have yet to find a company that specifically mentions language and accent in the DEI policy. They list every other categorization, but language is overlooked. Sometimes it's included in like as a general minority area of diversity, but it really needs to be the foundation of this. And then it needs to be talked about. We need to raise awareness around it. So I'm currently running programs on accent bias training, on raising awareness in that training of understanding where accents come from, why we have them, when and why we develop bias and preferences towards one or the other. Some of it is hardwired in us biologically. Much of it comes from our environment and society, and then take a really close look at the company itself and how people are interacting. Just having a small message at the top of hiring forms for the hiring manager can make a difference. And this was just proven in a study by a group of researchers called Accent Bias Britain, where they found that the biggest change happened when they just put a statement at the top of the hiring form to say accent bias exists, be careful, and do not be judging anyone unfairly based on the way that they speak or whatever their first language might be. Just that note to make the hiring manager stop and go, oh gosh, yeah, let me think about that. That was making a significant difference in the hiring decisions, making them more fair. So that's the first real strong step. And then it's about identifying when this is happening, stepping in and stopping it, making it clear that language and accent related comments and I wouldn't necessarily say bullying. Normally people have very good intentions when they say, oh, I love your accent. To me, I know they mean it really, really well. I know they mean it. And it's like, wow, they're complimenting me on my language abilities. But when you hear it every single day, every single day, and from the same people, it just keeps acting as a constant reminder that you're different, that you're foreign, that
Yes.
you'll never fully be accepted. Even if you live there 40 years, you're still going to be the foreigner. And that gets really tiring. So we need to start talking about it, sharing stories. And it does come from the leader. At the same time, if you're the person, just as we have been in Holland and in Denmark, we have to speak up anyway. We have to press unmute. We have to be visible. We can't silence our voices. What happens is we get into these awkward situations and we're worried maybe they don't understand, or we don't want to be made fun of, or we don't want them to laugh at us again or point out our foreignness. And so we start turning down our volume and stopping speaking. But the problem with that is they will only get better at understanding us, and they will only start to maybe not hear the accent as much if they hear us more and more and more and more and more. They have to get used to hearing us. They have to tune their ears. So if you do have an accent different from the majority in your workplace, you really need to talk a lot, even more than you would otherwise, because they're all learning how you speak. They're learning what your pronunciations are. And the more they hear it, the better they get at understanding. So we have to do the opposite of our gut feel of, oh, I'm going to just avoid that person because I'm so worried I won't understand. And I don't want to be misunderstood. We have to do the opposite and actually speak more.
So really, I hate to use the term because it's now been taken, but to lean into the situation and not run away from the
Right.
situation. And if you're a quieter
Mm-hmm.
voice, it comes from both directions. One, it's the leader to recognize who's speaking and who's not, and
Yeah.
from ourselves, that we also
Mm-hmm.
need to really work hard to step back into, like,
Yeah.
okay, we might get made fun of again today. I mean, that's, I have to do it, in the Netherlands too. It's like I'm constantly entertaining, and some days it's very
Yeah.
amusing,
Yeah.
and some days it is
Uh-huh.
not. Like some days
Yeah.
you're like, I just want to buy bread today. I don't need to be
Yeah,
laughed
really.
at, right? Like, and
Oh,
so I
is
can
bread
imagine
hard to
on
say in Dutch as well? Because the worst word for me in Danish is carrot rye bread. carrot rye bread. It is the worst Danish word on earth. And so I guess we both of us avoid the bakeries.
Right. No, it's
I
just,
would also
just
say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say it's just a simple thing. Sometimes, you just want
Yeah.
to do something simple and the accent or the language becomes
Yes.
the hurdle. So bread is actually pretty easy to say,
Mm.
but it's the analogous to something simple. So okay, that's
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. So I was just going to add as well for people with an accent. I know what helps for me and has helped for a lot of my clients as well, because I definitely feel a different level of anxiety when I have to speak up in Danish versus English. In English, I'm totally confident, loudest voice in the room, which I talk about in Unmuted, how to notice when we're the loudest voice and turn down our volumes. That's equally important. But I know it from my Danish when I'm being too soft or I'm pressing mute. When I go into a meeting, I do my best to speak up right away because I just need to get over that anxiety that's rising inside of me. And the longer I wait to say something, the worse it gets. So if I can just speak up and get over that kind of adrenaline rush or whatever negativity is going on in me, whatever hormones are going on, if I get over that and I break through it, I can immediately settle in a little bit more and feel like, okay, that's right. I remember now this is a safe environment. I'm okay. And that helps me. I also really appreciated Danish culture because it's quite normal when you enter a space, especially something social like a party, that you go around and shake hands with every single person who's at the party. And you do that from the minute you walk in. And that really helped me to feel more comfortable as I went around the room. So speaking up fast and early is really helpful to get over that anxiety and the nerves in the beginning.
Ooh, I love that. And that for any meeting facilitator can be very simple to do with just an opening icebreaker question to get everybody sort of settled in on their own. So I love that. I love that. Some great tips. Now we're reaching the end of our time, but I have a couple of questions that I still want to get to. One is with AI and diversity in speech. AI this year, everybody's using
Yeah.
ChatGPT and all the other
Mhm.
AI things that are out there. How does this
Mhm.
change how we communicate? Does AI have a bias when it
Mhm.
comes to
Mhm.
language in this way?
Yeah, and I would say everyone is using it who has a more typical globally recognized accent, because
Right.
especially generative AI and the speech recognition software. When the iPhone first came out in Singapore, Singaporeans couldn't use Siri because Siri couldn't recognize Singapore English, which is a completely validated variety. I mean, it's its own variety of English, but the accent is so different from American or British English, they couldn't be understood. So from the
Wow.
get-go, we had massive inequality in who could even use these products. We still see this today. I mean, there have been studies through looking at, for example, auto subtitles on YouTube, that people with accents, the subtitles aren't going to be, obviously, they aren't going to be correct as much as if it were you or I. And in fact, our subtitles would not be as correct as a man's. So even females are not subtitled the same. So AI is biased because it can only understand what we feed it. And if all of the content we're feeding it sounds like us, then of course it has the same bias that we have. It's going to have an easier time understanding people who sound like us and all of this input that we've given it, instead of this wide variety. So, I mean, since iPhone, I mean, I don't remember when that came out, 06, 07 or something, but now in Singapore, there's a lot of there are institutes doing AI work for speech recognition, processing the Singapore accent, all of these things, so that we have that technology now. But even if you look at things like pronunciation apps that are out there, a lot of learners all over the world want to use pronunciation apps, and it's really cool. You can talk and speak, and then the AI gives you the analysis, and it told me that I was 92% native, which that made me very proud. um, so I tell my clients, don't even look at those kinds of percentages, and don't compare yourself to a native speaker. That's even a word that's up for contention, because even a Singaporean is a native speaker. They grow up speaking English, they're educated in English, yet the world doesn't consider them that. So there's so much to this, but long story short, AI, especially in the area of speech recognition, is incredibly biased. It's already splitting up the world as to who can use it, well and who cannot, who's getting ahead in that area and who isn't. At the same time, generative AI could be a game changer that sort of levels things for the English learner that's competing in the global workplace. Because now, for example, when you go to write that email in Dutch, right, you can input it and then get it all changed. You can say, can you rephrase this to make it more concise and with a professional voice? And it can spit out your perfect email. Well, that just saved me an hour and a half, right? So for the English
Yeah.
learners who are struggling at work to get their emails proofread, or they have something really important and they want it to be right, they can start using it in new ways. And I think this could really be a game changer if we use it in the right ways and we allow people to use it in positive ways. So let's see. I think it's still way too early to really say a lot more than that, but there's so much happening and it's happening so quickly. But it is definitely going to change the way that we communicate globally, and hopefully it will level the playing field a little bit when it comes to the English conversations that are being held throughout the world.
Yeah, indeed. Pros and cons to every new technology that comes
Yeah.
out, as we've seen throughout history, of course. So, last few questions. I'm being trying to be more aware of the time. In terms of technology in general, I mean, we've just talked about this with AI, has changed how we communicate. What do we need to be mindful of? Is that similar to the last question? Is really just the biases that come out with technology, or are there any tools or applications that when we're talking that we need to be mindful of?
Um, I think going back to sort of the online meeting situation, I think we do need to be mindful about paying greater attention to each other, managing our time, knowing how long things should take, and giving the time that's needed. Because things sometimes can move a bit slower in the online space, especially in turn taking. We aren't always exactly sure when to jump in, and we might need longer pauses. And for especially in America, we just talk right on top of each other and we flow. But for someone coming into that culture, it's very difficult to know when it's appropriate to take turns. So normalizing silence and making that so it's not awkward. I mean, we only know awkward silence as Americans. Many other places in the world do not find it awkward. And leaving that space allows people to contribute, interact, speak up, but it takes a little bit longer. And we need to be mindful of that for sure. And then, as well as time, knowing the time zones, planning things accordingly for working with people around the world. It's ridiculous. Sometimes I'll get a meeting invite for 1 a.m. my time, and I'm going, don't you go to work at 8 in the morning? Like, why are you waiting till 1 p.m. to have this call with me when you know I'm 12 hours ahead of you? So really being mindful of where people are in the world as well. So there's a lot of changes, I think, just with technology and moving things online and the remote world.
Oh yeah, there's like yeah, it feels overwhelming. And as I'm talking to you, I'm
Mhm.
taking copious notes, and it does feel overwhelming. So, as one of the last questions I want to ask is, where do we start? Like, what's something after
Mm.
somebody's heard this interview? What can they do immediately upon returning to their virtual offices to improve or to become more unmuted, let's say?
Become more
What's a
unmuted.
tangible step that we can take going back to the office to improve the way that we listen, or
Mhm.
to maybe just to take more time with accents? What might be
Mhm.
something tangible that people can do?
Well, I think we can never go wrong with becoming more self aware. So, taking a little bit of time to think about the influences in your life, the values that you hold, and how they might be different from others in your team. From an accent perspective, a very simple exercise that I love to do with my clients is simply to think back to your favorite movies growing up. What movies did you watch, especially Disney films, animated films, or what have your kids been watching if you're old enough now and that's more recent and it's easier to remember. So what have your kids grown up with that, and what were the voices like? So for example, in The Lion King, the king has a gorgeous American hero accent. The villain, the bad lion, has a British accent. Now, what's really interesting is that these two lions are brothers and they're both in Africa. So it's like, why? Why? Why is the good guy
Nothing makes
American and the
sense.
bad guy is British? And why do they have these accents in Africa? They're African lions. So, what is it that we've learned through our culture, through, listen to the accents of the newscasters on television, listen to game show hosts, listen to talk show hosts, listen, what do they sound like? And what impression does that give you? And then think about as well the contact you've had with different accents in the world. So if, for example, the only time you've heard an Indian accent is when you were super frustrated calling Microsoft about your computer program, then maybe there's an issue there that comes up when you then have to deal with someone on your team with an Indian accent. So becoming really self-aware, that would be step number one, as you go back into your office and are maybe contemplating what you've heard today.
Oh, I love it. So really sitting, and that goes right back into the active listening. I would say really sit and listen for the accents in your life and think about what comes up for you. I love that. And I would say really giving people time to speak. Give them the time to get out, because a lot of people are thinking while they're talking. I mean, and so that's why listening is so important, is actually you're helping them think. So that's why just be really quiet. I love it. In my workshops, I always I leave a big long pause when I ask a question, and then I use a little humor to break up the awkwardness. I always say, "Oh, I always wait until it feels awkward. That felt awkward. Let's move on," right? So because there's this big pause and they're all expecting me to do something with it, but you really have to just sit in the
Let
awkwardness
it sit.
let it sit there, because inevitably, I would say 85-90% of the time, somebody speaks during that silence. And that's what we're looking for. I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. Heather, thank you so much for being with us today. I have one last question, which is, where can people find you online if they want to connect? Where is the best place to learn more about you?
I'm always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, so feel free to track me down and connect. And then my websites are heatherhansen.com, where you can learn a lot about my book and my work on accent bias. And my training company is globalspeechacademy.com.
Love it. And I'll put all of that in the show notes for easy access. I want to thank you so much for your time today. I took copious notes and I look forward to putting them into the show notes. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Until next time, be powerful.